If you come to the UK illegally, you will be detained and deported and never, ever allowed to stay. Period.
An eye-catching new policy on migration unveiled in a big aircraft hangar today by the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage. He's leading in the opinion polls, but could his plan work? We will discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam, not in the normal Newscast studio, but in the pop-up Newscast studio in Salford, because I've been standing in for another week for Matt Chorley on 5 Live, and you can listen to that 2 till 4 every weekday. That show and this episode of Newscast is going to be focused on one big story, though, which is Reform UK's big policy proposals for dealing with what they call illegal immigration. That's deporting people who come to the UK in an unauthorised way. And this is a package of measures that a Reform UK government would put in place, basically meaning anyone coming to the UK without permission would be sent back either to their home country or a third country, and there would be no way for them to claim asylum and ultimately end up as a refugee in the UK. And a big part of this would require the UK to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. So lots to discuss with BBC News correspondent and veteran of the Home Affairs and Migration beat, Tom Symonds. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Adam. Hi.
And also joining us for the first time on Newscast, but probably not the last, is Dr. Alice Donald, who's Associate Professor of Human Rights Law at Middlesex University. Dr. Donald, hello.
Hi, Adam.
Right, welcome to Newscast. Okay, lots of things to discuss. Let's break it down into various different bits. I suppose, Tom, the first thing is kind of the optics. Like this was a big event that Reform put on today, wasn't it?
Yeah, it looked like a sort of campaign event, dare I say. Big, echoey, I think it was an airport hangar, wasn't it, Adam?
In Oxfordshire.
And absolutely. And clearly with cameras, audience, and therefore voters in mind. So absolutely a big deal for Reform.
Right, let's look at some of the details then, and there's lots of different elements of this. I suppose the easiest one is what Reform would call the carrot, which would be offering people in the UK who'd come from other countries in whatever way money to leave and help to leave.
Clearly, if Reform can get people to leave, put themselves on planes of their own accord, then the sort of job of putting them on planes against their will is completely avoided. And last year I was allowed into the Home Office's fairly secret facility in Bedfordshire where they train people to put people on planes, and it takes 3 security staff to get them onto a plane safely and get them out of the country. So if you can avoid all of that cost, then clearly that's the way to go for Reform in this new world that they're offering us. But of course, the question is how many people are going to agree to that, given that they've come through enormous obstacles to get to the UK and, in their view, find a new way of making a living here.
Right, now let's talk about the centrepiece of their policy proposal, which is the idea of deportations. When they talk about deporting illegal immigrants, what people are they actually talking about here? Because we don't necessarily have illegal immigrants in the UK, do we?
Well, it's complicated. There is an act still in place, the Migration Act 2023, which effectively makes it illegal to come into the UK via a small boat. The government's going to repeal that act, has already said this, as part of a new immigration legislation that's going through the Commons. But it is still going to be effectively illegal to come on a small boat because the government wants that to be an illegal thing. What's not illegal, because of the rights that asylum seekers have, is seeking asylum, which is why everybody who comes off one of those boats doesn't run off into the shingles of Kentish beaches. They agree to be taken in by the border force and agree to apply for asylum. So there's the use of the word illegal is clearly controversial, but under the current system we have, it is not illegal to seek asylum in this country.
But Alice, this is what Reform would change, which is they would basically, temporarily rip up the entire international refugee sort of system for the UK if they were in power.
Yes, that's right, Adam. And I think really what this looks like, if we just take a step back from the sort of theatre and performance of today, is an attempt to really destabilise, or it would have the effect of destabilising the kind of post-war human rights, international law settlement. The talk then is of pulling out of the European Convention, derogating, supposedly, that's temporarily suspending the effect of the Torture Convention, which in fact is not possible to do under the terms of the UN Torture Convention. Also pulling out of the Council of Europe Trafficking Convention. And indeed, one could add to that list, because the UK, if they wanted to complete this project, a future reform government would probably have to also pull out of the Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it would be a very dramatic intervention and destabilisation. And I noted that Nigel Farage wasn't ruling out also including children in this plan, which is why the Convention on the Rights of the Child would also potentially be, certainly would be relevant as well.
We'll come on to some of the consequences for the ECHR in a second. But Tom, why did that thing about potentially deporting children actually come up in the first place today?
I have to say, I was on air while this was going on. I didn't hear that bit, Adam.
Okay.
But he was asked, what he was asked a number of times by a lot of journalists is, did he have concerns about sending people back to potential torture, potential loss of life in the countries they had come from? And I think at one point he did accept that it did concern him, but clearly the tenor of all his answers was that the effect on the UK's problem with migration really concerned him more than the risk to those migrants who may be sent back to very difficult situations.
My reading of the day about why children came up was because it could be if you had families coming over on small boats who are then classed as illegal immigrants, would you be prepared to deport the whole family, or would you just be deporting the adults? And then what would you do with the child? And then separately, you can have people who are here in the country illegally, as it were, who have children while they're here. And we're not like America, where if you're born in Britain on British soil, you automatically become British. Therefore, you'd have an issue about if you were going to deport the parents because you'd track them down, what would you do with the children? That was my understanding about why we were talking about children in the first place in the story. Okay, so Alice, let's go back to then withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. I was actually quite surprised. It sounds like actually the formal process of saying we don't want to be in it anymore sounds like it's quite easy. Actually,
yes,
practically.
Yes, one might say alarmingly easy in a way. Yes, so there's a provision in the convention itself which allows governments to, the word is to denounce the convention, which effectively means giving 6 months' notice of wishing to withdraw from it. So the only state ever to have done this is Greece under the military junta. In the context of course, severe repression, summary killings, disappearances, etc., in the late 60s. So Greece effectively left before it was pushed, and indeed came back into the convention system in 1974 once democracy was restored. So no state apart from Greece has, certainly no democracy, has ever exercised this possibility of leaving the convention. But in fact, the convention itself, it presents very few obstacles to doing so, just 6 months' notice.
Tom, just what are the very basics of why Reform is making this pitch to pull out of these conventions in the first place? What do they feel it would allow them to do?
Well, it allows them to deport people who come here and make an asylum claim, which currently can't be done. You have to consider the asylum claim, which can take about a year, hence the need for the asylum hotels. But if you don't have that requirement under international agreements, then you can simply turn people around when they arrive in the UK and send them back to wherever. And that's one of the practical problems we're hearing there. So that it's as simple as that. And which is why Reform wants to make this simple point, that this enables them to go where other governments haven't been able to go. And I think the rule that they would set out is that if you come in on a visitor's visa and hang on to that visa and hang on in the UK after that visa has run out, then you could also be told you will never be able to apply for asylum in the UK. So that is all at play for Reform if they manage to do this big move of pulling out of those international agreements. Interestingly, the government is doing something, a tiny bit of this, with its one-in, one-out deal with the French. So what they've said is that if somebody comes in via unofficial routes, they can be sent back without their asylum claim being heard, because, of course, France would then have to deal with that. But that needs an agreement with France. And I think all of this will require Reform to be building agreements with other countries.
If I could just add a bit of context here, I think 2 points. One is that the figures show that of the people who arrive on small boats who claim asylum, some 2/3 of them are successful and are given refugee protection. And for some nationalities, the acceptance rate is, almost 100%. Countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan. So I think we need to also be careful about this suggestion that people arriving on small boats are, they're all economic migrants, or they have no business being here. They're not genuine refugees. So the figures would suggest that that's not the case. The other thing I think is really important
Reform is
to
saying
hang on.
Reform is saying you don't even consider that, because if it's about your mode of arrival determines your fate, and if you arrive on a small boat, you're getting deported.
But that does mean then that we would be deporting genuine refugees if the existing patterns were to be continued. But I think the other thing that's really important to inject into this is, in a sense, how kind of aberrant this discussion is becoming in the UK, in the European context, because, there has been sort of some pushback from some European states in the context of immigration in relation to the European Court and so on, and the constraints of being in the convention and the obligations. But in no other European state is withdrawal from the convention any part of kind of mainstream political discussion. So, I think it's really important to hang on to see in a way how kind of insular, maybe even parochial, the discussion has become here. And it's paradoxical, actually, because in fact the UK really is an exemplary member of the convention system. So last year there was one judgment of the European Court against the UK. In the last few years there have been one or two a year. So this is not a system which is, regularly kind of overruling democratically made decisions. It's a very healthy relationship in a way, and the UK is regarded as an exemplar with our Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament and so on. So there's a real paradox about the amount of kind of heat and fractiousness, bitterness almost that this debate has taken on, when in fact our relationship with the convention system is one which is very well functioning and is regarded as an exemplar across Europe.
Now, this week I am still at the BBC HQ in Salford, standing in for Matt Chorley, which is quite inconvenient when it comes to Newscast, because it means that Tom and Alice are sat in the studio without me, and I'm having to listen to them in my headphones rather than chatting to them face to face like normal. But there is some convenient things, like the fact that you can just phone up Richard Tice, the Reform UK Deputy Leader, and do a live interview with him on the radio, and he'll say yes. So let's play you the conversation I had with Richard Tice about 2:20 on Tuesday afternoon on 5 Live. So first things first, I just wanted to ask you about the language that Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef, his colleague, were using at this press conference this morning. They talked about an invasion by migrants, and they talked about fighting aged men. Why use such kind of almost like military language to describe the people who are arriving in the UK?
Does the truth hurt? Is it so uncomfortable for you that you can't tell the truth? 180,000 people.
Why not working age?
180,000 people have come to this country via boats illegally in the last 6 or 7 years. And the truth is, they are almost all young men who are undocumented. We've no idea who they are, and regrettably, we know that a number of them, a not insignificant number, have gone on to commit crimes, drug dealing, money laundering, or worse. And some of them come specifically as members of gangs, for example, Albanian gangs and others, with the intent to commit crimes. So yes, I think the language is appropriate. The crisis is a national emergency, and the British people are raging furious at what's gone on and the utter failure of this Labour administration and the previous Conservative administration to get to grips with this. There's nothing more important than protecting our women and girls.
And I'm not disputing public concern about it, but it's describing the people as of fighting age. I mean, you said young. You didn't say fighting age. You could use other phrases like working age. Why fighting age?
We live in a world because we actually, in a democracy, pride ourselves on free speech, freedom of expression, telling it as it is. And that's the reason that we are leading in the polls, because we tell it as it is. It's uncomfortable. None of us would want to be in this position, but we are where we are, and we've got to deal with this. And that's why what Nigel announced is we've got to leave the ECHR, we've got to scrap the Human Rights Act. Those are the key weapons that allow the lefty human rights lawyers to conduct this lawfare.
A question about numbers. The number was of 600,000 deportations was used this morning at the press conference. Where does that number come from? And what numbers would you use when you're talking about when you're predicting how this is going to work?
Yeah, it's widely accepted that there are plus or minus 1 million people who are here in this country illegally. The truth is, we don't actually know, but it is of that sort of order, and we've made it clear that look, we welcome smart, high-skilled, highly qualified immigration where people integrate, they work, they want to learn the language. Great. But what we can't tolerate is people coming here illegally, working illegally, suppressing British wages, consuming our public services, and in many cases then going on to benefits. Well, if the whole point about immigration is to come here to work, well, then why does anybody who's come here as immigrated to the UK, why do they need any benefits at all? You either come here to work or you don't come here.
And so just in terms of the practicalities of the proposals, I mean, this wouldn't be able to start on day one of a reform government, would it? Because you'd have to give notice that you were departing some of the treaties. You would have to then do the deals with the countries to either return people to their country of origin, or you'd have to do another kind of deal like with Rwanda to send to a third country. So actually it could be a couple of months, maybe even a couple of years before it actually happens.
The intent and the planning will take place before a general election. We'll be preparing draft legislation produced by our own lawyers and barristers. We're not going to rely on civil service folk to do this. And so we'll get lots of stuff ready. And then, yes, there'll be a process of implementation. But people will understand in the run-up to the general election, this is what we plan to do. And we are deadly serious about it. And I think that's what the British people want to do. Now, if the Labour government recognise the concerns of the British people and say, actually, once again, reform is on the right track, and the Labour Party, they copied us on defence, spending 2.5% and then towards 3% of GDP on defence. Well, if they want to learn from our immigration policies and do this in the current administration, good, that's to the benefit of the British people. We're glad to lead by example and lead the way in policy making.
So just talking about that implementation period, well, you get all your ducks in a row as the new government. So what could that be? Could that be years or would that be months?
We think it'll be months, and I think people know that we are pretty businesslike. We get stuff done. We're not mucking about, and that if anybody can do this, then it's Reform UK. And what we need is a decent-sized working majority so that we can drive this through as rapidly as possible. Is it easy? No. Would all of us rather not be in this position? Yes, but we have to deal with the facts as we face them. We've got a national emergency of illegality, and we've got to deal with it. It is as simple as that.
Labour put out a press release saying exactly 4 months ago, Zia Youssef promised that Reform would publish a comprehensive strategy, a full policy document, a detailed plan with year-by-year timelines and clear targets. That's not what we've got today, though, is it?
Well, we've set out a clear plan. We've set out some very, what some people would describe as tough, uncompromising policies and plans. There's a reason why actually we don't give all of the details to the opposition, what we might call the enemy, and that's because we don't want to give them all the tips of the trade. We know there is a detailed whole raft of details behind this, and we will continue to work on it. We'll continue to work on the draft legislation required. And also, as you work with lawyers, you have to look at the pluses and minuses of particular routes, and you tweak it, you adapt it, and then say, well, it might not work because of this or that. So all of that we're looking at over the coming couple of years before a general election.
We've had a text from Ollie in Oxford who says, could you ask Mr. Tice how an Afghan interpreter who's had their details leaked in the data leak will be able to legally claim asylum for them and their family in this country that they helped during the conflicts. So that's a bit about actually, would you still be able to take people in for humanitarian reasons under this new regime? And Ollie also says, how can I have my human rights protected if all human rights law is going to be repealed? So there's kind of two things there. Would you still have a route for humanitarian arrivals?
The key thing is, and Nigel said this morning in the press conference, that genuine Afghan translators who worked alongside the British forces, of course, they will be welcome. They should have been accepted by now. But if they haven't been and they're still not being processed, if they are genuine, regrettably, there are many people who have tried to jump on that bandwagon. That's just a fact of life. With regard to human rights, look, you often get things with the best intentions when the Human Rights Act was invented, but it's been hijacked by the lawyers and used to a whole raft of different ends. Let me just remind everybody, in the 80s and 90s, before the Human Rights Act in 1998, do you know what? The economy was growing at 2.5 to 3.5% per year. We were all getting better off. Public services worked. The country was in a much better place than it currently is. So actually, the world's not going to end if you haven't got one piece of legislation called the Human Rights Act. And before that, we acted on common law, on precedent, and things worked rather nicely, thank you.
Okay, Richard, I mean, you sort of suggested that this is as much about putting pressure on Labour to kind of go in the right direction. If we get to the end of this Parliament and actually the small boat arrivals have fallen quite significantly and people feel actually there's more sense of control, like would you abandon these plans and go, actually, the system ain't so broken after all, or maybe even say Keir Starmer's succeeded in fixing it?
If Starmer has fixed it, great, then we'll all celebrate, we'll all be pleased. Will we abandon the plans? No, because we think that actually we've got to make sure that our borders are secure, our sovereignty is secure, and our women and children are protected. So these are important, necessary measures. But if the government's made progress, then credit where credit's due. Let's look forward to that. I hope they do. But we are, frankly, very sceptical, and we need to prepare a plan B and C in the event that this government's plan A doesn't work.
And when Nigel Farage says he thinks there's a risk of civil unrest because of the level of immigration, what does he mean? What does that unrest look like? What's his worst case scenario?
Because we actually get out and about, we knock on doors, we speak to people, we meet groups in pubs. I've done a couple of such meetings just in the last 2 days, and let me tell you, the rage, the anger, the pure fury amongst the British people is at a level that we've never experienced before. And it's not unreasonable to essentially alert the mainstream media and the establishment class as to what is going on out there in the real world. And that's why you've seen what has been almost exclusively peaceful protests from mums and dads outside some of these migrant hotels. And of course, we want protests to be lawful, peaceful, rational. But in a sense, that decision by a judge in Epping recently, that was as a direct consequence of lawful, peaceful pressure put on the council to take the hotel owner to court. And I think the judge's decision was in part response to that lawful, peaceful protest. So that's a valuable and highly respected part of a functioning democracy, and that's who we are.
But isn't the problem, though, what you're promising, the earliest it could come into force would be in beyond 4 years' time, and so actually you're highlighting the anger that exists now, but your response to it is something that's going to, in theory, be in place in 4 years. So isn't that? If you can
have a word in the Prime Minister's ear and ask him to call a general election earlier, then we'll be delighted. Bring it on.
I'm just getting at the point that isn't the responsible thing to do to try and quell the unrest rather than acknowledging the risk of the unrest and having a solution that's years down the line?
The reason that there is such anger out there is because politicians are not telling it as it is. And the reason we're leading in the polls is that we are telling it as it is. We're reflecting the mood of the people, and people want this dealt with. And if us talking about this, putting pressure on the government, forces the government to adopt some of these measures sooner rather than later, then we're doing our job in opposition. And bearing in mind, of course, we are the real opposition, as in fact I think Keir Starmer recognises.
With your 4 MPs.
And our 33% in every national poll, we're leading by 7 to 10%. So you can argue it both ways. The reality is we are a serious political force that are the current favourites to win the next general election.
And just on the issue of when the next election is going to be, why did Nigel Farage make that little kind of sidebar point at the news conference today that when someone said, oh, the next election in 4 years' time, and he said, oh, really? You think it'll be that long? What do you reckon is going to happen?
Well, he then went on to refer to the 30-year bond yield of the cost of government borrowing. We are heading towards a serious financial drama sometime in this parliamentary term. The cost of 30-year government borrowing is at a record 30-year high, give or take. And there's a lot of very anxious economists and people like me who've been warning you cannot keep spending more than you're earning to the tune of £150 billion a year when the economy is barely growing, and expect it to end well and expect the bond markets to be calm and rational about this. So we have some serious economic challenges ahead, as well as the immigration challenges that we've just been talking about.
And you think that the pressure from the bond markets would force Keir Starmer to call an early election?
Look, it's hard to predict the future. What I can predict is that we face a very difficult financial position in the months and years ahead. And this government, if it doesn't properly get to grip and start reducing wasteful government spending, then there's trouble ahead.
Okay, Tom, let's talk about some of the practicalities then. So how would these deportations just actually practically, logistically work in the reform brain?
Well, we already deport people, of course. And actually, let's be careful about the word we use, because deportation generally applies to foreign national criminals. So people have committed offences here. They are then sent to somewhere like Brook House, the immigration removal centre at Heathrow, Colnbrook. There's another couple so that's at Gatwick, Brook House. There's a couple at Heathrow. So they're like prisons. You're not allowed in and out. You do get to keep a phone. And you're kept there until you are taken to the airport, sometimes in handcuffs, and then put on the plane and flown back. I think you're given some money to help you the other end, but that is that. The correct term for people who are being sent to another country because they haven't been given asylum is removals, but I think the reform will end up probably always using the word deportation because it has a bigger impact, I think. So that's what happens, but it is expensive. The government has increased the number of removals and deportations, especially with foreign national criminals. But clearly what reform's talking about is of another order. And I think crucially, they're saying that anybody, bearing in mind you won't be able to claim asylum under their system if you come in on a small boat, anybody who comes in, tries to claim asylum, then has to be held in a detention facility. I think they're planning to build some new ones. So that's an additional practical economic demands on your policy that you're going to have to provide. So it becomes quite complicated. And then, of course, there is the practical difficulty of what you do about the end country. So you're going to fly a plane with people on board to a country like Iran, which is going to be very tricky. Are you going to need the support and the cooperation of the country they're going to? Reform are saying, yes, you are, and therefore you're going to have to potentially pay some money to incentivize those countries to take back people who we don't want to consider their asylum claims in this country. So all of that is not a simple process.
And also Reform's argument when you say, well, hang on, what if country X doesn't want to do a returns agreement with the UK, so you can't send people to them? They've got a twofold response. One, which is a diplomatic thing of, well, we'd put the thumbscrews on country X, for example, applying sanctions to their individuals and their businesses, or stopping giving visas to people from country X to come to the UK at all. And then the other thing is they'd say they'd have a backup of you'd then return somebody to a third country like Rwanda, like the Tories are planning to do, or a new third country like Albania.
That's right, and that's difficult. We know that this government has tried to create a sort of returns hub policy with Albania, and the Albanians have said they're not terribly interested in that idea. So the idea that countries are sort of queuing up to take back people who've not been given asylum or not had their asylum claim considered in the UK, well, let's see. I mean, I think what this all comes down to, and I think the sort of overriding analysis you might put on all of this is that the general tenor of Reform's pitch today was this is simple, common sense policy making. And I think clearly, just from the discussion we've had so far on the podcast, it's not simple and it won't be simple. And some people might say, well, look, reform pushed Brexit when that came up and said that this was a simple idea that we could take back control, and reform turned out to, and Brexit turned out to not be simple. So I think this is the kind of area we're talking about. But let's be clear, there are some very angry people in communities. I've been to Epping a lot in the last few weeks, to Canary Wharf, to Cheshunt, where there are asylum hotels. There are very angry people there who say they should not be in their communities, and that is what reform is looking at. That's the people they're trying to sell this policy to.
And you mentioned the point about detaining people, because of course at the moment, if you're in the asylum system, you get housed by the government, and that could be in a hotel, that could be in private rented accommodation, it could be in something that looks a bit more like a facility, but you're free to enter and leave. That's not a prison. That's not like being detained.
It's not, because you're not regarded as doing anything wrong. You're regarded as somebody who's making, under your rights, as we've talked about internationally, an asylum claim. You're not allowed to work, and that's because this government and many other governments, previous governments, have decided that it's much better to pay a fairly small amount to people so that they don't need to work to literally have something to eat, rather than have them compete at the bottom of the British jobs market for work against British workers. And you are given some healthcare. You are, I think, probably, as Nigel Farage said today, given some dental care. The hotels that are being used, it has been claimed that they are sort of some kind of luxury hotels. They're not particularly luxurious. The one in Canary Wharf that recently opened, I tracked down a guy who worked in maintenance at that hotel, and he said really it kind of needs a lot of work. It's not exactly a luxury hotel, certainly anymore. And of course, then if you are given asylum, the government stops paying for you. You can then work, and the burden, if you like, of making sure that there is housing and support goes to the local authorities. So it's quite complicated, and it's certainly not an easy. Asylum seekers are not given a vast amount of resources. They are given some resources. It's got to be said.
And under the Reform Detention Centre plan, they would build facilities that could hold, 24,000 people pending their removal. And I was just looking, and actually our biggest prison that we've got is about 2,000 places, isn't it? So this would be the equivalent of creating 10 of our biggest prisons again.
Exactly. And Reform have said today that they have some ideas about where they might go, but they won't say, because I think both Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef have said they're worried that Labour might sell that land off, that the government might sell that land off to use for something else to prevent them from building these detention centres. And so they're not going to be clear about where they're going to be at this stage. But don't forget, every time you say you're going to build one of these facilities, you are likely to get some sort of a local protest. Having said that, if they are secure facilities where asylum seekers are not allowed in and out, you might imagine that might damp down the protest locally.
And Alice, just to go back to this thing about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights and just the knock-on effects that might have in all sorts of different bits of British life. 2 questions. Number one, just explain why it is that this could jeopardise the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, at least in a lot of people's assessment of that.
Yes, well, effectively because the treaty is contingent upon the UK being a member of the European Convention, and that protection being afforded to people within its jurisdiction. So, ergo, if we left, we would be in breach of the treaty.
Or you'd have to renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement with Ireland.
Which I think would be very difficult and inflammatory. Yeah.
And then in terms of what would replace the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, which is what puts the Human Rights Convention into British law, and which Tony Blair did in 1998, presumably we would still have rights in the UK post that, would we?
Well, it would depend really what, if anything, replace. So certainly you'd have to repeal the Human Rights Act if you were to leave, if the UK was to leave the convention. So you'd need a parliamentary majority, of course, to do that. But supposing that happened, it would depend what, if anything, you replace the Human Rights Act with. So, as you know, there have been various endeavours over the years to do just that. Dominic Raab's one being the latest, which went nowhere in the end, to have a so-called British Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights, yeah.
But one of the complicating things here is, of course, that we have also the common law here, and it contains this, that the common law, of course, consists of a set of, in some ways distinct from the convention, but also overlapping rights and freedoms. Of course, personal liberty, access to justice, the right to a fair trial, freedom of religion, freedom from torture, indeed. So, it would
so
be,
basically some of the things that judges are using now, which Reform don't like, they would still be using in future because they're British.
Indeed, yes. So it would be very, improper really to be instructing judges then to disregard that as well, to sort of in trying to sort of unpick those, historic rights and freedoms, which of course are often invoked by politicians like Nigel Farage. We don't need the convention because we have our wonderful British tradition. So one might say, well, you can't have it both ways. If the common law is to be respected and valued, then that also, enshrines, for example, the prohibition of torture.
And just last point for me, Tom, it was interesting talking to Richard Tice and hearing Reform people today, because you can almost imagine that they actually don't want to implement any of this. And actually what they really want to do is to just put pressure on the government to be tougher. And the fact that Richard Tice says, if Keir Starmer smashes the gangs and solves the small boats, then we wouldn't need to do this.
I'm not so sure, actually, Adam. I think that there is an intent there because I think there is a genuine belief that there is a sizable part of this country's population now that really has had enough of immigration, and this type of immigration in particular. I mean, specifically this type of immigration. So I kind of felt they were fairly serious when they said what they said. And it'd be interesting to see how the politics of this play out, because, of course, the government has to stop the boats and, as you said, I think in the interview, significantly reduce the number of people coming in by small boats, and it has committed itself completely to stopping the use of asylum hotels. Now, if we get to 2 or 3 years from now and neither of those things has happened, well, then the politics get quite difficult for the government, because this, you can be sure, is going to be a key reform talking point during the next election. And you might wonder whether the government will start to consider what it can do on human rights, on the Refugee Convention and all of that, to give itself some more leeway. So I think if they can't do it the way they're trying to do it, by policing, by intelligence, by using counter-terrorism techniques against the people smugglers, and by very good administration to get rid of all those asylum claims, then we shall see.
Tom, thank you very much.
No problem at all.
And Dr. Alice Donald, thanks to you too.
Thank you very much, Adam.